Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's session. Today we are going to hear Professor Farhat Hussain Saab, Professor in Medieval and Early Modern South Asia, Department of History, University of Delhi. And the title is Reading Women's Poetry in 19th Century India, Gender and Memory in Early Modern Literary Sphere. As you can see, his book is also Voices in Verses, Women's Poetry and Cultural Memory in 19th Century India. A formal introduction is given by now Professor Nishad Zaidi Saba, who is professor and former head at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. And the concluding remarks will be given by Professor Simi Malhotra, also from Jamia, professor of English, director of Center for Northeast Studies, Jamia Millia Islamia. So welcome you all. And now I invite Professor Nishad Zaidi for a formal introductory remarks. Thank you. Nishad Saba.
Thank you so much, Razi Saab. Thank you so much for organizing this series, for inviting Farhat Saab for the lecture, and most importantly, for giving me this opportunity to introduce his lecture. It is a rare privilege, to introduce someone like Farhat Saab, um, who tonight, is going to speak on women's poetry and cultural memory in 19th century India. Professor Farhat Hassan has always amazed me by his jaw-dropping erudition combined with his unassuming personality, which is such a rare blend to find in academics these days. When I asked him to send me a brief bio note so that I could, introduce him properly, his response was, very characteristic of him, which was like, my life has been banal and uneventful, so please focus on the book. so, but trust me, his life has not been uneventful. He has, it has been a stellar career all through. He did his MA from Aligarh, and then he did his MPhil and PhD from Cambridge University after being awarded the prestigious Commonwealth Fellowship. He has served Aligarh Muslim University as assistant and associate professor, and then he moved on to Delhi University. He has also been associated with the Center for Women's Studies in Aligarh. His first book, State and Locality in Mughal India, Power Relations in Western India, was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2006. And as expected, the book was shortlisted for the award of the best book in Asia in the field of humanities by International Convention of Asian Scholars based at the International Institute of Asian Studies, Leiden. His second book, Paper Performance and the State, Social Change and the Political Culture in Mughal India, was again published by the Cambridge University Press in 2021. He has been a fellow of Cambridge Commonwealth Society. He has published a large number of papers. I needn't even mention that. Then he has also been associated with some fascinating projects as a main investigator or co-investigator. And one of the projects which I found very fascinating is his University of Leipzig project on multiple secularities, which I hope to discuss with him someday. Today he is going to discuss his third and the latest book, which is this one, Voices in Verses, Women's Poetry and Cultural Memory in 19th Century India. This book engages with two taskiras, both published in the second half of the 19th century. One is by Hakim Fasiuddin Ranj. It's called Baharistan-e-Naz, which was first published in 1860, and after some revision it was again published in 1869. Then the second taskira which the book focuses on is by Durga Prasad Nadir, which was published first in two parts, and later the third time it was published in a combined form, and the third publication also had some additional list of poets. So these are the two taskiras which are the core subject of study of this book. Now taskira, as we know, is a term that derives from the Arabic root zikr, which means to remember or to recall. And hence the primary purpose of Tazkira is to remember, the literary past. And likewise, these two tazkiras also are about, reconstruction of literary past. Pretext and context are crucial to all tazkiras in tazkira tradition, and this tazkira is no different again. There are introductory remarks, bio notes, and other discussions about each poet discussed. So this tazkira again fits in that tradition of literary tazkiras where pretext and context are presented by the author to establish a literary tradition both diachronically as well as synchronically. So what distinguishes the two tazkiras that discussed in this book are that they do not focus on male writers, male poets, like other tazkiras published before these tazkiras. They are exclusively about women poets. Now that is something unique because earlier tazkiras, as the book tells us, be it Meer's tazkira, Nikhat Shora, or later Musafi's tazkira, they either do not mention women poets at all, or if they at all mention women poets, then they are, pushed to the margins, just a list, an appendix at the end. So this tazkira therefore is, this book therefore is a huge, huge addition to feminist literary historiography because it opens up a new source which allows us to learn about women poets. Now, this book, to my mind, is an extraordinary achievement in the field of feminist literary historiography because it brings to light two previously unknown or little known, sources, and then, more than this, this very impressive feat in itself, of recovery and comparison. This book is also remarkable for its theoretical originality and insights because it draws on the tradition of feminist scholars. And here, Professor Hassan, traces right from Gail Minot to Asia Alam, a young contemporary feminist scholars, or Lambert Hurley, and then it also draws from memory studies, talking about the limitations of memory studies, and then moves on to include the decolonial frame coming from Walter Mignolo, suggesting that these tazkiras are acts of epistemic disobedience. So both, theoretically as well as empirically, I think the book is a huge, huge achievement. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. This is absolutely remarkable, and I really invite everyone to read the book. But some of the points that I would like to, especially mention are, some of the highlights of the book. Each chapter in the book is accompanied by an appendix, which gives excerpts from the book itself, relevant excerpts of relevant sections from the two tazkiras. So the reader can directly learn the content of the tazkira and important aspects of these two tazkiras. So from these excerpts, we get to know about the spat between the two tazkira writers, which I found fascinating, both accusing each other of plagiarism, and not just accusing each other of plagiarism, but also suggesting, accusing each other of adding fictitious compositions of imaginary and bogus women. This is something very interesting, especially those who work in the area of women's writing, because we know that in early modern times it is very difficult to decide whether the writings were originally done by women poets or writers, or were these actually male writers taking the bogus female writers pseudonym, etc., or taqallus. Then we also learn from these excerpts that both these tazkira writers, in their imagination, Hindu and Islamic past forms a kind of continuity. They do not really distinguish that these two pasts or see a conflict there. So this I found very interesting. And then the women poets who are discussed, they belong to different class of society, different sections of society. On one hand we have a lot of women poets who were practicing courtesans. Then there were women poets who belonged to the elite classes, and then there are also women poets, and we have examples, we have excerpts of their poetry, who belong to European society. For example, one Mrs. Baker, who wrote under the pseudonym of the Takallus of I think Malika, right? Um, so we have these range of women poets. One wonders whether these tazkiras also include women poets belonging to middle classes, women of sharafa classes, women who were the subject of Deputy Nazir Ahmad's novel, or Thanvi's book by Ishti Zebar. So that is something that I'm curious to know. Lastly, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the translations of women poets, verses that Farhat Saab has presented in his flawless translations. I must congratulate him. I mean, he's a history person, he's not a literature person, but still the translations are absolutely fascinating. And before I invite him, I really don't want to go on and on, which I can, because the book is so fascinating. But before I invite Farhat Saab, I would like to quote one couplet which I really liked. I mean, I liked many more couplets, but I would like to quote here one couplet by a poet called Dulhan Begum. And the couplet goes like this. First, I will recite the Urdu couplet. मत करो फिक्र इमारत की कोई ज़ेर फलक, मत करो फिक्र इमारत की कोई ज़ेर फलक, खाने दिल जो गिरा हो उसे तामीर करो,
वाह वाह
खाने दिल जो गिरा हो उसे तामीर करो.
वाह वाह
Now I would read Farhat Saab's beautiful translation. Don't trouble yourself worrying about buildings below the skies. Repair instead the broken heart that lies fallen on the ground. I think this couplet has a message for all the researchers not to waste their energies on things that are apparent, that everyone can see, and rather focus on unveiling the hidden treasures, erased voices, and invisible agendas, which this book precisely aims to do, and it does achieve this objective. So over to you, Farhat Saab. I'm so looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishat, for those very generous, if undeserved words. Um, actually, what needs to be said has already been said. I mean, see, you actually rendered me totally redundant. I mean, uh, those would be the substantive highlights of the book, and they've all been covered. Um, so I would be actually repeating you, or maybe in a different language. Um, you see, this project. Uh, uh, or this book is a part of a larger project uh, that aims to look at how uh, history and literature can be brought together and to see if we can do better history if we have the sensitivity that comes with literature, or conversely, if we write better literature if we have the science, if we have the sense of time that comes with history. Uh, and in this effort to bring literature and history in conversation with each other, I looked through the literary texts that were written in the 18th and the 19th century. So I went through poetic compilations, divans, biographical compendium, tazkiras, the glossaries, works of literary criticism. And one thing that became very obvious to me was that the literary sphere in 19th century India was homosocial and gender segregated. Because in none of these works there is any reference to women. And as you pointed out, I mean, one could take the case of me, for example. He wrote a very important biographical compendia of Urdu poets, Nikat Shora, in the 18th century, and mentioned no women. Similarly, in about the same time, Gardezi wrote another compendium of Urdu poets. And again, that text doesn't mention any women poets. Musafi, who wrote in the early 19th century, also does not mention any women poet in the main body of the text, but has an appendix, Atma, in which he provides brief notices of 5 women. So just when I was coming around to this view that literary space was gender exclusive and excluded women, I noticed this taskira by Fasiuddin Ranjmerati, Baharistan and Nas, written in the, as you pointed out, later half of the 19th century. Uh, the unusual thing, obviously, was when all the other literary texts uh, refused to mention women scholars, this was a text that was exclusively devoted to women scholars. And just when I was reading this text, I also found repeated references to an intellectual rival, Durga Prasad Nadir, uh, who wrote Taskarat-un Nisa, which was again exclusively devoted to women poets. So there are these two texts that rupture the dominant narrative and provide a very different understanding of the literary sphere in colonial India. Uh, so, I mean, I was wondering as to, first of all, let's see as to what these texts were aiming to do. Uh, uh, and one, there are 3 or 4 things that come across when you look at these taskiras. One is that they contest this assumption that the literary sphere was gender segregated and was marked by the exclusion of women. Women did have an unusual presence in the literary sphere and were involved in the shaping of the norms of literary aesthetics and expression, something that had been pushed aside from any discussion in the literary culture of the period. Whereas at the same time, these texts also render us sensitive to a deliberate act of historical silencing. And there are a number of reasons why I see this as deliberate, but one evidence is very obvious. Both these texts refer to the daughter of Mir as an important Urdu poet. Mir, in his own biographical compendia, does not mention his own. Uh, Clearly, then there is the deliberate silencing of women's voices in the dominant literary culture of the period. Uh, for this reason, I think there is this. These are these are texts of immense resistance, and they are resisting the erasure of women's voices from the registers of cultural memory. Uh, at the same time, as you pointed out, they also provide an important insight about the nature of the literary sphere in colonial India. Uh, it's not just that women were present in the cultural spaces, but there is an immense diversity and range of women poets within the literary space. So there are two dominant divisions within which these women poets are discussed in both these taskiras. One is called the secluded scholars, Parda Nasheen Aurat, and the other are called as women of the market, Bazari Aurat. Within these two categories, too, there is immense diversity, and there are immensely detailed ways. I need to uh, see if I can find passages from the book, and there are ways of describing these women of the market. I hope I find it. If I don't, uh, just give me a minute. Very yeah. So these Parda Nasheen, these Bazari Aurat are also described as Mehboob-e Farhat Baksh, the pleasure providing beloveds, uh, the vendor of beauty in the marketplace, Husnu Faroshi Hazuri. Uh, they're also described as alluring attractions of the market, Hasinane Bazari. Uh, so there's an unusual description of these women, but there is also a huge range of women that come under this category of women of the market. So you have on one hand someone like Melaka, who is a high class courtesan. She has 200 servants in her employ, provides patronage to other poets, and surprisingly enjoys wrestling. It's hard to imagine today a wrestler uh, taking a liking to the poetry, but that's what the Mailakha is all about. But if you have someone like Mailakha on one end of the spectrum, you also have someone such as Kamman, who has a small stall in a market in Bharatpur and sells an intoxicating drink bhang to the workers who are coming from a day's work. And as she serves bhang, she also recites her own poems. So there's an immense diversity to the women poets who may find their place in the literary sphere. So what the impression that you get is that this is an extremely accommodative and inclusive literary sphere. And I think this marks it out from the European public sphere, European literary public sphere, where you notice systematic exclusions on the basis of gender, class, and race as well. Uh, and it is this element of inclusiveness in the literary sphere that I think sets it aside from the West European historical experience. Uh, the other problem was how to read the women's poems that you find in these two Taskiras. Uh, there are there, there are three or four issues here. Um, I tend to argue that the women's verses in these Taskiras uh, constitute an act of unveiling uh, in a society which insists on veiling their body as also their speech. Uh, so there is a natural act of resistance to these compositions, irrespective of the content of the poems, the content of the verses, the fact that there are these verses in circulation, in sites of social communication, is in itself an act of resistance, uh, because it is, as I see it, an act of unveiling. Furthermore, I also see that in the process of this unveiling, there is also a realization of selfhood. So I also tend to describe them as forms of self narratives. Uh, we could debate if these forms of self narratives could be characterized as autobiographical or not. Clearly, there is a perception of selfhood. There is an articulation of self through the medium of these literary compositions. Uh, at the same time, I don't see that there is a self that is represented in and through language, but these verses actually constitute that self. So language constitutes rather than represents uh, identities or self-identities or articulations of identities of women poets in these compositions. The second issue uh, that troubled me was that most of these poems were not recited; they were performed, which meant that word was not an autonomous bearer of meaning, but meanings emerged out of the entanglement of words with non-verbal means of communication. Most of these compositions were accompanied with music, with singing, with fragrances, with pan and other luxurious items in circulation. There is an entanglement of words with the oral, the visual, and the tactile means of modes of meaning apprehension. Uh, uh, and for this reason, I argue in my book that there is a text space correlations that defines meaning making in the context of these literary compositions. Uh, but the other problem is what happens when these compositions are removed from their social context, from their performative context, and become a part of a an entrenched textual tradition. That is to say, what happens when these compositions are then inscribed in the taskara of these kinds. Uh, so how do the meanings change? How do their objectives change? How do their purposes change? And I argue here, uh, let me just check if I can find it. Yeah, I mean, and we'll come back to it in a minute. But I argue here that these texts are then, once they become a part of an entrenched textual tradition, these texts are appropriated for middle class reformist sensibilities and become a part of the project push for the agenda of women's education, a very modernist project, and very unusual too, because just imagine what these texts are doing then, invoking the compositions of prostitutes and concubines, dancing girls and public entertainers to push for the agenda of women's education. Both Durga Prasad Nadir and Ranj are very clear in their introduction to the text that they are writing these texts to serve as an inspiration for women to take to education. So there's an enormous privileging to the agenda of education in both these texts. And if I am allowed, I would like to cite uh, the what these. Maybe I'll be able to find it. I hope I do. Um, I should have planned it better, but that's how my life works. It's very chaotic. Um,
Page 28, maybe.
oh, you have it. Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm
20.
reading page 46. Yeah. So
Yeah, 43,
Fasiuddin Ranj
46.
Merati, yeah, he says it is incumbent lazim on human beings to seek knowledge and learn new skills. As humans, we should do things in our lives for which we are remembered after death. Life is a priceless possession; it should not be wasted. Nobody should surround oneself with the darkness of ignorance and view one's fate. Talent and knowledge enhance the status of a person, and our ancestors have rightly said, civility comes with knowledge. The only thing that differentiates a human being from an animal is knowledge. Knowledge releases one from ignorance, jahalat, and makes a person rational, natik. The difference between worship and pretense is only known to those who have the essence of humanness, insaniyat, in them. An illiterate person is a living embodiment of shameless faithlessness. After all, an illiterate person cannot recognize God. And he goes on and on further. The point is that these compositions then become a part of a project, a modernist project to push for women's education. But there are two differences here. In pushing for the reformist project of education, the inspiration comes from the roots of Indian culture. So there is a rejection of European teleological framework, which makes this project very different from the project of someone like Raja Ram Mohan Roy or Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, for that matter. For these reformers, uh, education had to be the normative ideal for this agenda of education was Western Europe, and we need to inspire, or we need to learn for, or we need to emulate the achievements in education that had come in Western Europe. What these writers are doing is making a push for education, but situating their agenda within an indigenous frame of reference, invoking invoking the cultural resources within India. So I think that's important transformation that takes place once these poems become a part of a textual tradition. The third issue, yeah. Uh, you see, yeah, okay. You see, after all, as Nishad pointed out, these are texts of memorialization. Um, and therefore, one needs to see as to what are they trying to do as texts of memorialization, and how do they enrich our understanding of memory making in colonial India. And I make an argument that most of our frameworks for doing memory studies uh, is derived from Western historical experience. Uh, and therefore, texts like these help us move away from European perspectives in developing alternative frameworks for doing memory studies. There are three important elements here. Uh, One is that they memorialize, they commemorate women's voices. Now, this is important because um, across cultures, you could look at the Islamic world, you could look at Western Europe, um, the memorialization is usually reserved for men because men are considered to be the agents of history. When women are remembered, they are remembered for their procreative functions, they are remembered as mothers, they are remembered as obedient wives to their faithful spouses. They're never remembered for their creative literary pursuits. So this is an important difference that one notices through these texts, and and pushes us to rethink uh, on the significance of gender binaries that informs memory studies in Western Europe. So there's a conscious rejection of that binary in these texts of memorialization. Secondly, there is also an obvious political objective uh, that one needs to be attentive to when you read these texts. Um, when they commemorate women poets, they also commemorate, for example, the Begums of Awadh. Now, they are being remembered immediately after the annexation of Awadh in 1856. They are celebrated as poets of immense creativity, but they are also celebrated as important patrons of art and literature. This is a very implicit indictment of British annexation of Awadh. Similarly, when the Begums of Bhopal, for example, are remembered for the patronage they provided to poets and also for their own creative pursuits, this is again an indictment of British colonial power and the nature of its alien rule. There are also a large part of the this text is devoted to poets of the Mughal period, and you have discussions on the verses allegedly composed by Nur Jahan, Jahan Ara, and not just Jahan Ara, but even the slave of Jahan, Amani, for example. Uh, what are these? Does this suggest? There is obviously, therefore, an articulation of the harem as a site of immense creativity. And therefore, there is simultaneously a rejection of harem as, as depicted in Orientalist culture, a site of male pleasure, a site of excess, a degenerate site of Asiatic degradation. So there is also again a political contestation that one notices in the way Mughal queens and princesses and slave girls are remembered in these texts. But one also notices, and I hope I have that here. One also notices something else, which is that there are discussions of engagements discussions of contestations between women and the rulers in these texts. Some of these engagements take place with the queens and the princesses, but sometimes also with ordinary women. And in all these contestations, in all these conversations, in all these engagements, women come out better. Women come out clever. What does this mean in terms of perception of sovereignty? We'll come to it in a minute, but let me give you an example. Uh, so there's this case of Timur, Amir Timur, who's a plunderer, uh, invading the subjects in Samarkand in Central Asia. And one of the person they captured is this blind woman who is also a poet, Daulat. Um, Daulat means wealth. So when she is presented before Temur, Temur says, is wealth without sight? This woman is blind. In a befitting reply, Daulat retorts, if she were not blind, how could she have come into the hands of a lame person? Temur is lame. So you can see, I mean, this may not have happened. Certainly, it didn't happen. But these engagements serve to re-articulate sovereignty as a vulnerable human entity and to represent the king in more human terms, contesting the the image of infallibility with which the dominant state archives represent the emperor. I mean, the other thing, and that probably I should end here, or maybe, yeah, I think let's finish. The last thing that I want to um, argue here is that you see in the reformist literature of the 19th century, and in most of the modern writings on reforms, we get an impression of the centrality of household as the authentic unit for the articulation of gender relations. So people argue that there is a certain normative idealization of familial intimacies and household spaces in 19th century India. Uh, Now, these texts disturb this narrative, and household emerges as an extremely contested site. So and I think maybe if we have time, we can take this up. There are instances of husbands in love with prostitutes, and those love affairs are celebrated in the text. Uh, uh, there are instances of of desires unfulfilled, representation of desires unfulfilled in these spaces of the household. And there are also references to homosocial intimacies destroying the stability in these spaces of the household. So let me cite one of this, and then yeah, I think I found it. So there's this person, yeah, um, whose wife, and she's called Tuti, um, is very tired of her husband's love for boys, Imrat Parasti, and to mend the ways of her husband. This is the couplet she presents to her husband. Uh, I'm giving you the translation of it. Just give me a minute. Somebody's calling. Yeah, yeah. So he says that impudent person, so who imbibes the beauty of the world, referring to the boy that her husband is in love, Oh God, if only I could sleep with him in the night. My lord, referring to her husband, come and let's resolve this issue between us peacefully. You embellish his world while I take care of his dick. Remarkable. I mean, it is hard to imagine these compositions finding their way in the emerging textual tradition. The larger point that I'm trying to make here is that there is a contestation of household as an idealized representation of social life in these texts. Huh? Um, yeah, I think I can end there and we can have a discussion. Or alternatively, I could cite a ghazal or two in easy language that I find in these collections, and then we can end it if we have time for that.
Farhat Sahab, you have time if you wish to recite ghazal or anything from the text. That's
नहीं,
fine.
आपके टेस्ट के ऊपर भी है. If you want
No,
it, we
no,
can do that. Huh?
I'm just giving you this space and time. After
Okay.
that,
So
we will
just to
have the,
just to give a sense of what
yeah,
these collections are about.
and then we
Um,
will have the concluding remarks
yeah.
after that, and then we go to questions.
I will not bother with translating these poems, huh? Because I'm sure they're in easy language. So yeah, okay. So just one. This is by a person called Sadar who belongs to the Abad household. Huh? Uh, oh, this is a long ghazal, so just a couple of verses. जोशे जनू में रात दिन सबसे रहा अलग अलग. In my passions, I was separated from people day in and day out. जोशे जनू में रात दिन सबसे रहा अलग अलग. मैं हूँ जदा, I'm separate from others. अलग अलग लोग जुदा अलग अलग. मैंने बलाएं लेने को, बलाएं, there's a gesture that you reach out to the person with your hands. मैंने बलाएं लेने को हाथ बढ़ाए जब उधर, मुंह को फिरा के यार ने मुझसे कहा अलग अलग. शम्मा जलाने आए हैं आज वो मेरी कब्र पर. He has come to my grave to lit a candle. चलियो खुदा के वास्ते वादे सबा अलग अलग. Let the winds not come this side. Uh, um, खाक को जिंदगी भला तेरे मरीज इश्क की. मैं हूं दवा से दूर दूर मुझसे दवा अलग अलग. Okay, we can end it. Thank you very much.
That was quite good. I mean, I'm sure the entire ghazal will be very entertaining. Now we invite Professor Simi Malhotra for the concluding remarks, and after that we will go into question and answer session.
Right. Thank you so much, Raziuddin Saab. And of course, I must congratulate you for this series, such a rich series. And I'm so glad that you invited Professor Farhat Hassan. I mean, I'm going to embarrass him a little bit by saying that I've always been a big fan of him and his work. So, and of course, he puts all us literature walas to shame by, I mean,
Come on.
no, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And as a historian, I mean, of course, one can borrow many things from his book and from his, from his general oeuvre of writing about his engagement with literature. I mean, he's been saying that as a historian, literature is something, but of course, we know the legacy that he has from his parents and, of course, his brother also being a poet. But but I mean, such a rich work, Farhat Saab. I mean, not only is this, and I think this book is very, very valuable and important, not only in in terms of opening up a very new archive of the Tazkiras for scholars of both history and literature, and probably of all of humanities in some senses, to look at how what we consider public literary spheres were being and they need to be expanded, and they have been expanded in many of these literary cultures and reworkings of these literary cultures, but certainly in Urdu so significantly by the insertion of these tazkiras of these women poets, and I think that's a very, very important archive. As an archive, it's an archive, I think, and I think you already hint at the divans, which I think will also become a source of great engagement for a lot of scholars who can probably follow up on the heels of your work, Farhat, and probably take on those divans as probably sources that they can work with in some senses. I'm aware of, people who've been following you, including your students who've also been doing very rich and good work with this kind of, scholarship and this kind of an archive in that sense. But, and I think Nishat has very rightly pointed out the value of this work, not only in terms of opening up empirically a new domain of knowledge for all of us, but also extending some of the arguments theoretical arguments in this field of not just feminist literary historiography, but memory studies, post-colonial studies, and so many ways in which one can look at your work. But I just wanted to probably in my concluding remarks highlight some of the things which I found really, really unique about Farhat's book. I mean, it's a very special book. I've absolutely enjoyed reading Farhat's prose always, but I mean, this time even more so from cover to cover, including each word of the acknowledgement and the back cover and everything that I've read. It's been an absolute, but I mean, what has been a real discovery for me, Farhat, is the fact that you're a translator, and I think you can put a lot of translators to shame, because I mean, of course, we can all follow Hindustani, but your English translations of those Hindustani texts is just absolutely fantastic. And the other thing which is really rich, which also Nishat pointed out, is that the appendix, which kind of accompany all chapters, actually does not, I mean, of course, one is hankering to read the tazkiras, and one wants to look at the divans, and one wants to go to so many other archives that this particular work opens up. But the fact that you've included them as part of the chapter does not leave the reader bereft. One feels that one can access them, and one can read them, and one can get a sense of what you're trying to tell us through that. But in terms of the arguments that I think Farhat offers, and this is something that us literature walas and historians can probably take back with us from this book, is how he has opened up so many fields of inquiry. And so I think I'll just list 5 or 6 points that strike to me as the most striking about the arguments that he offers, apart from what Nishat has already said and what Farhat himself also spoke about. But I think one of the things that Farhat's work tells us is that when he looks at these poets and he tries to give us the context of that poetry by talking about that, how the context is not just in the words which are there and which subsequently become part of compendiums and therefore become part of literary cultures. But the context of this work is the place of the performance, what accompanies that performance in terms of taste and sound and smells and, all the plurisensorial ways in which one needs to access that particular performance. And I think this is a very, very important and significant contribution, because while we talk about public sphere and we talk about literary public spheres, we do talk about performative public spheres in some senses. And I think this particular work opens up a whole field, to my mind, for us to look at and probably to almost recover, these texts back from literary public spheres, which modernity, so well showcases. And of course, Farhat makes that argument in his work that how modern literary spheres in some ways also try to domesticate many of these, these accounts, which are otherwise fairly subversive, which are fairly counter-memorial, they're part of the subjugated knowledges, and obviously are in some ways engaging with political questions of transgression, etc. But I think what I find really something which Farhat's book has really opened for us, and for me certainly, is this whole idea of probably trying to recover the performative from the literary and to look at the performative public sphere of this rich, body of work. And this public sphere is both, as he rightly points out, that the bazari aurtein, and of course the secluded women in the household, in some senses. It talks about both these spaces in some senses. And I think if we look at these spaces as performative spaces of how gender gets performed in both these spaces, I think we get a very, very rich account in some senses. So I think for me, the fact that this poetry, and I mean, of course, we talk about poetry and emotions and gender, et cetera, when one looks at literary cultures, but the fact that this emotive universe is something which is part of a larger effective community of performative culture is, I think, is a very, very rich contribution that this particular work makes. And I think that's why, let's say, one of the points that Farhat makes, and he's almost, almost apprehending one of the questions, and he in fact names the person also, that in ways in which these tazkiras are kind of structured, that there's the biography, and in some ways there's an accusation that why should there be biographies of these women, which already kind of predetermine how you must read these texts, etc. But I think what Farhat is also trying to tell us is that these biographies need not be read only as biographies as we understand biographies to be in some senses, because for him, one needs to expand the frontier of biography, not just in terms of, autobiography, biography, and those kind of narrative accounts that we have, but also as biographies which are somatic, also as biographies which are bodily, also as biographies which are also erotic in some senses. And I think the sample of the ghazal with which you ended, gives us a sense of what this biography really can tell us about, what these lives were like and what these lives were really read like, and in some ways, this unveiling, which is such an important metaphor of the work that you've done, Farhat, is such a, this act of unveiling of this veiled knowledge in some senses also tells us that how we need to rethink the categories, not just of modernity, of public spheres, but also probably of categories of biographies and of autobiographies, and to look at probably biographies as more performative, which are, more somatic, more bodily, more erotic, and which is something which is really exemplified so well by these poems, and I've really enjoyed reading these poems and the translations, in that sense. And I think the other point that I think which is very important is, and in some senses, I mean, of course, we understand that no idea of modernity can really be completed without the question of gender, and I think the fact that, Farhat started off by saying that, how this space, which is otherwise considered as homosocial or, gender exclusionary, almost gets fractured by the insertion of this particular lever of this, rich body of work by women, which I think, I mean, we see that in many literary cultures, which is that you can't complete the story of modernity without the inclusion of gender. And I think this particular story would not have been completed without the insertion of this particular piece in that sense. But Farhat does a little bit more than that, because he's also asking us then to think about modernity. And since, I mean, Nishat also mentioned Mignolo's idea of epistemic disobedience, which is not just something which is there as part of what the content of much of this poem is, but also in terms of this compendia, because, I mean, as Farhat argues in his work, this is a mediated text, of course. I mean, these biographies, I mean, these are mediated texts, but I mean, the mediation is such an interesting mix in some senses, because it's an intersection of, class, community, of many kinds of genders. And I think the question that Nishat posed, which is that, how do we at all know whether these are women or not, and that I think in some ways is an interesting, thing that, and I think in some ways Farhat is also answering this question when and I really like how you pitted that, Farhat, in your writing, where you have this distinct, and where we can really see Farhat, the historian at work, where, where the question of authenticity, when it comes up, you make a distinction between what is authentic and what is genuine, and I think the fact that you posit the category of genuineness of the work within the compendium or the context in which these texts exist, kind of probably obfuscates this question of authenticity, which can be always asked of questions, of any kind of an anthologization or any kind of a compendium which primarily looks at these kind of works. But really, I mean, in that sense, and I think the other thing which I also found very interesting is how tazkiras are sites of memory, and I know Farhat has a fascination for Foucault also, but I really, what I really liked, in the work that Farhat you did, which is not to just simply look at it as subjugated knowledges or counter memory, but the whole idea of erudite knowledge. And I think this is such an important category, you know, and I think there is so much that one can do with a category like erudite knowledge when one especially encounters a new archive like this and one is trying to make an argument and present it differently in relation to not only its entangled history with colonialism, but also in terms of its own entangled history with a public sphere, which is largely dictated by men compiling that sphere or creating the compendium, and how almost like an erudite knowledge it emerges, you know, as something which is asking us to think before it in some senses. And so that's also something which I really found very interesting. And I think what Farhat's text also helps us do is to also problematize the whole idea of what does it mean to narrativize the self. You know, how do we narrativize the self in some senses? Is it only through words? Is it only through certain literary genres? And I think Farhat is also asking us to extend, you know, and you know, especially this question is for us literature walas, which is, you know, us who are invested in, you know, high cultures or knowledges, etc., how there's a whole under you know, body of work of popular culture, of popular knowledges, which is also asking us, and the category which I really enjoyed, and I think this is a category that I'm going to borrow from your work, Farhat, is the aesthetic category that you offered to us, which is of course of shock, but primarily of delectation, you know. And I really like the idea that that there is this new aesthetic category which, you know, this particular body of work offers. So when one poses this question that, you know, the form of this poetry is very much entrenched within the larger dominant idiom of what is dictated by men, but I think in some ways even formally this poetry is trying to do something which offers us new aesthetic experiences and affective categories in that sense. But you know, I mean, I can go on, but I don't think I should really hog all the space. But Farhat, I mean, really, it's been such a pleasure reading this work. It's been such an enriching work. I mean, not just in terms of the archives, but the questions that you posed, and also the questions that you made us, you know, think about through your work. Really, I must congratulate you, and of course, thank you for offering me this opportunity to read your work. Really, thank you so much.
So wonderful, so wonderful. And now we will go for the questions session. But before that, just an announcement for the coming Saturday, and then we enter into the question and session. Haris, please can you show the Haris? Okay. Well, a real leap forward from literature to a very hardcore political thing. It is RSS and Hindutva versus India and Indians, and all the three present here are people from the left, very well known, Shamsul Islam Sahab, Subhash Khatake, and Apurva Nandji, and they are going to talk on RSS, Hindutva versus the rest of India and the Indians. And now let's go into the question and answer session. Haris, just take it off. Okay, thank you. Everyone, I'm the one who is going to do this part because Rafat and Faisal both are missing here, the usual hosts for this section. So anyone who wants to ask any question or have any comments, please raise your digital hand or just write something in the chat box. Or if you cannot do any of that, wave your hand. So please, someone with the WM, I guess it is Siddiqui Saab, please unmute yourself. Unmute
जी,
yourself.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम
And be brief, please. Just ask question.
जी, मैं ताहिर महमूद हूँ। मैं तो बेटे का अकाउंट यूज कर रहा हूँ, वासिफ महमूद है तो WM आ रहा है।
That's okay.
और वीडियो आपने सबकी क्यों बंद कर रखी है? आज मैं तो अपना चेहरा मुबारक दिखाना चाहता हूँ।
तो सर आप वीडियो में हैं, आप जस्ट क्वेश्चन करें। आप वीडियो में हैं जी।
अभी आपने इसको जी फरहत भाई अस्सलाम वालेकुम, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, वंडरफुल, बहुत शानदार आपने टॉक दी। और खास तौर पर मैं भोपाल से हूँ, इसलिए भोपाल का जो आपने जिक्र किया, वहाँ की बेगमा साहिब दीवान शायरात थी और उनके दीवान मौजूद भी हैं भोपाल में। इकबाल लाइब्रेरी बहुत मशहूर है, उसमें ये अजीब बात है कि मीर साहब की बेटी शायरा थी और भी खवातीन दिल्ली और हैदराबाद दक्कन में, लखनऊ में जो उर्दू का शोहरत है उस वक्त ऐसा हो नहीं सकता कि खवातीन इस फील्ड में ना आई हो। लेकिन आप देखते हैं कि अलिफ से लेकर ये तक कभी हमारे सामने ख्वातीन शायरात का नाम नहीं आया। एक तो उसमें यह बात है कि उस जमाने में तो खुद लड़के भी शायरी करते थे, तो बाप मना करते थे कि इस चक्कर में मत पढ़ना, तुम कहाँ के बेटी हैं। और फिर दूसरी बात ये हुई कि वो माशरा जैसा मेल शावरिज्म, जिसको अंग्रेजी में हम कहते हैं मर्दों का, वो अब होते होते अब कम हुआ है जाके, वरना सदियों रहा वो मामला। तो हम अपने कोर्स में देखते हैं, जब हमने छठी क्लास से उर्दू पढ़ना शुरू की, हाली की नज़र पढ़ी, फिर एट पे गालिब, नाइन्थ में मीर तकी मीर मुसफ़ी और दर्द, और जो शोरा हैं। खास बात यह है कि एक भी किसी खातून का नमूना कलाम हमें नहीं पढ़ाया गया। कितनी ज्यादती की बात है। क्या वो इस पाए की शायरात नहीं थी? हो सकता है मीर गालिब के पाए की ना रही हो, लेकिन किसी हैसियत की तो थी। बहरहाल उनकी कम से कम एक दो जो नुमाइंदा शायरात थी, उनकी एक दो गजलें बच्चों को जरूर पढ़ाना चाहिए, ताकि मालूम हो कि भाई खवातीन भी शायरा हो सकती हैं और रही हैं, और बहुत अच्छी शायरी की है। ये जो आपने भोपाल की मलिका जो थे, उनको बेगमात कहा जाता था। सिकंदर जहां बेगम उनकी बेटी, शाहजहां बेगम उनकी बेटी, सुल्तान जहां बेगम, वो खुद भी साहिब दीवान शायरा थी। उनके जमाने में खवातीन का मुशायरे होते थे बाकायदा, महफिल, और वो उनके दीवान मौजूद है। तो इस पे जरा सा ये मेरी राय है, वो गलत हो सकती है। आपका क्या ख्याल है कि शायरात को नुमाइंदगी अदब में क्यों नहीं दी?
जी, थैंक यू खुदा। जी जी, फरज साहब।
जी, आ, या आप बिल्कुल सही कह रहे हैं। मतलब ये एक अजीब सा इशू है, और आप सही कह रहे हैं कि ये प्रॉब्लम सिर्फ 19th सेंचुरी तस्कराज में नहीं है, ये आज भी मौजूद है। आज भी जो उर्दू पढ़ते हैं वो मीर को पढ़ते हैं, मीर की बेटी को नहीं पढ़ते हैं। आज भी उर्दू पढ़ने वालों को मीर, शायद ही कोई बंदा होगा जो उर्दू पढ़ता हो और मीर का नाम नहीं सुना हो, लेकिन किसी को शायद ये नहीं मालूम होगा कि मीर की बेटी भी उसी कैलिबर की शायरा रही हैं। तो इसमें मेरा ख्याल तो यह है कि तीन चार वजूहात हैं। एक तो वजूहात एक वजह तो ये भी है कि अ, जैसे जैसे समाज मॉडर्न हुआ है, और जैसे जैसे समाज ने अंग्रेजों की या विक्टोरियन नोशंस ऑफ मोरालिटी इम्बाइब किए हैं, तो ये एक समझ ये बन गई थी कि औरतों औरतों की जो डेफिनेशन है, औरतों की जो शख्सियत है, वो डिफाइन होती है उनके घर से। तो औरतों की एजेंसी, सॉरी मैं थोड़ा मिक्स करके बोल रहा हूँ हिंदी उर्दू, वो उनके प्रोक्रिएटिव फंक्शंस या उनकी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज एज मदर या एज वाइफ, इससे बाहर नहीं समझी गई। और थोड़ी सी ये भी है कि जब भी बाहर निकली हैं औरतें, जिन्होंने कदम रखा है घर से बाहर, हाँ, तो एंग्जाइटीज भी बहुत रही हैं। बहुत एंग्जाइटीज रही हैं, और जिसकी वजह से, तो मैं ये मतलब जो जो मैं कहना चाह रहा हूँ ये कि ये सोच लेना कि मॉडर्निटी से विमेन के हकूक बढ़ते हैं या विमेन की समझ बढ़ती है, ये है नहीं ऐसा। बल्कि शायद पिछले समाज में ज्यादा स्पेस थी फॉर विमेन टू आर्टिकुलेट दे क्रिएटिव एक्सप्रेशन, दे क्रिएटिव, अपनी एजेंसी को आर्टिकुलेट करने की ज्यादा स्पेसेस थी, जो शायद कम होती है।
So, Faraj sir, let's move on to other question. I can
जी
read for
जी जी
you. I can read for
जी,
you.
बताइए
Someone
बताइए बताइए।
भावुक to everyone. वो लिख रहे हैं, sir, reading books like Buraqe Delhi and
दिल्ली,
coming
हाँ
down to historical novels like Kai Chand, this Kai
हाँ
Chand Sare Asma, we find women quite well versed in poetry and even having compositions to their name. So why was it that in the People's Progress and Renaissance debate, why did the Indians, especially Urdu critics, didn't use this to show progress or higher status of women in India as compared to Europe?
I mean, that's what I was trying to say. I mean, I think there are three or four issues here. One is that uh, you know there is a tendency that defines modernity in 19th century India, to look at or to restrict the role of women to the spaces of the family and household. Uh, that's one issue. That's one thing that's happening. So that women's creative expressions were seen as, as arousing fresh anxieties. The second thing I think that's also happening is that it's about poetry too, because even when there is a push for women's education in the colonial period, uh, it was always insisted that women should be educated in useful sciences to make them perfect managers of the household. So they should do religious texts well. They should be good in accountancy. They should be good in mathematics. They should know Urdu well. But for women to read poetry was something that was immoral. For women to write poetry is something that's abominable. So I mean that those attitudes were beginning to shape the discourse on women and discourse on women's agency in defining modernity.
चलिए तो let's move on to other question. Nigar Zehra, I would love to know what inspires Farhat sir as a writer.
What inspires me? Nothing at all.
Are there any particular writers you take inspiration from? I mean,
No, there wouldn't be one, right?
Two questions in one, or maybe there are two questions.
No. Obviously, I have good friends. Some of them specialize in literature. People like Simi and Nishad. So I get good guidance from them. I began my career as a historian, working with the most boring aspects of history. Looking at issues of property transactions, legal order, or whatever. So this is an experimental work. This is the first time that I have dared to move in realms that I'm not very familiar with. And it's very, very exciting and very self-fulfilling to get those endorsements from such fine scholars as Simi and Nishad.
So let me then ask to a couple of professors here who are neither writing anything or not expressing. Asim Siddiqui Saab, would you like to make any comment? Asim?
Yeah, Asim is a good friend of mine. So
where are you? I mean,
can you hear me, Azim bhai?
जी, बिल्कुल.
Yeah, we can all hear you, Asim.
Yeah. Actually, I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. First, the initial remarks of Nishad, they were very expressive, and actually they gave a fair idea about the book. And of course, I have known Farhat Saab. He has been very modest here. He was a very good student right from days, not only of history, but literature also. And literature runs in his family. So I think that he was modest. And I have not read this book, but I got a fair idea from his lecture and from Simi's last remarks about this book. So Razi bhai, nothing more to say. I'll just read this book. This actually whetted my appetite to read this book. And I can just congratulate. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Asim.
Yeah.
Sir, may I?
Yes, Azim bhai. I'm done. Nothing more to say.
Sir, may I ask a question?
I think someone
Sayyid Amir wants to ask a question. I think मेरे ख्याल से Sayyid Amir.
Please unmute yourself and ask.
Razi, you're muted,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Sir, I am Sajjad.
Sajjad.
बिल्कुल पूछे सर, बिल्कुल.
I am Sajjad, and it was a wonderful talk.
Sure.
So my question to Farhat sir is, sir, एक हिस्टोरियन है, उन्होंने मुबारकपुर पे लिखा है, जैसे कि मैम ने निशाद जैदी मैम ने कहा था कि ये जो आपने तज़किरात जो आपने सेलेक्ट किए हैं बहुत आर कंट्रास्टिंग, डिटेल्स जो देते हैं कंट्रास्टिंग है, एक्यूजिशंस भी है. So how does a historian reach to a point? जैसे कि मुबारकपुर पे लिखा है, I'm forgetting the name of the construction of communalism in India. Who is the author of that writer? A very stalwart historian.
Gyanendra Pandey.
Yeah, Gyanendra Pandey. He has written a good deal about the Kasbah of Mubarakpur, where he situates. I mean, एक वो हिंदुस्तानी नैरेटिव एक किताब को सिलेक्ट करते हैं और दूसरी तरफ से एक ऑफिशियल डॉक्यूमेंट जो कि ब्रिटिश डॉक्यूमेंट रहता है, तो उन दोनों को वो सिचुएट करते हैं और उसमें वो फिर कंट्रास्टिंग डेट्स भी देखते हैं, कंट्रास्टिंग नैरेटिव्स भी देखते हैं. हाउ डज फरहत सर डू दिस थिंग कि व्हेन तज़किरात्स आर गिविंग the contrasting details, or they are making accusations. एक historian कैसे एक middle ground पे आ सकता है in yeah that is my point.
Okay.
सिद्धार्थ साहब, ये एक तो ये बहुत अहम चीज है जो निशात ने पॉइंट आउट करी कि ये दोनों तस्करा ऑथर्स आपस में बहस करते हैं कि कौन सी एंट्री ऑथेंटिक है, कौन सी एंट्री फैब्रिकेटेड है. ये लोग एक दूसरे पे इल्जाम भी लगाते हैं कि आपने मेरा स्टफ चोरी किया है. वो कहता है नहीं, आपने ये एंट्रीज मेरे तस्करे से चोरी करी हैं. तो ये एक दिस डज इंडिकेट the emergence of a new literary culture in which issues of authenticity are suddenly becoming important. ये issues अगर आप मुगल पीरियड की टेक्स्ट देखें तो ये बिल्कुल अहमियत नहीं है इन चीजों की. ऑथेंटिसिटी पे कोई बहस नहीं होती, किसी टेक्स्ट में नहीं देखेंगे आप मुगल पीरियड में. सेकेंडली, ऑथोरियल इंटेंशनैलिटी, ये भी एक नया डेवलपमेंट है. ये भी मुगल पीरियड में एब्सेंट है, ये भी 18th सेंचुरी टेक्स्ट में एब्सेंट है. आप रूमी फॉर एग्जाम्पल देखिए, जब रूमी ने अपनी गजलें लिखी तो ही एट्रीब्यूटेड द ऑथरशिप टू हिज पीर फ्रॉम तबरेज. So the fact that I am the author and this is something that has emerged out of my creative pursuit is also something that is happening for the first time. हम इन इश्यूज को देख नहीं रहे थे इस किताब में, लेकिन ये भी एक इम्पोर्टेंट है कि हाउ इज द इंटेलेक्चुअल कल्चर चेंजिंग इन दिस पीरियड. और ये तस्करास हमें उस शिफ्ट की तरफ भी निशानदेही करते हैं ना. जहां तक इशू ऑथेंटिसिटी का है तो वो मेरा कंसर्न नहीं है. आप बिल्कुल सही कह रहे हो, जो बहुत सारे वर्सेस जो हैं वो फैब्रिकेटेड है. जो वर्सेस नूरजहां को किए गए हैं, एट्रीब्यूट करे गए हैं, जो वर्सेस जहां को, सुल्तान रजिया को फॉर दैट मैटर, who's in the 13th century को attribute किए गए हैं, they are all fabricated. ये इशू नहीं है मेरा इशू जो है वो दूसरा है. मेरा इशू ये है कि हिस्टोरिकल मेमोरी में, कल्चरल मेमोरी में कौन कौन सी आवाजें विमेन को एट्रीब्यूट की जाती हैं, और उससे व्हाट काइंड ऑफ एन इम्प्रेशन डू वी गेट ऑफ जेंडर रिलेशंस, नॉर्म्स ऑफ एस्थेटिक्स एंड द एजेंसी ऑफ विमेन. तो इस बहस में पढ़ के जो प्रॉब्लम रही है बहुत सारे क्रिएटिव टेक्स्ट के बारे में, खासतौर पे हिस्टोरियंस तो बहुत ज्यादा इस बारे में हैव बीन वेरी डेफिशिएंट. आपने बहुत सारी संस्कृत टेक्स्ट मुगल पीरियड की नहीं पढ़ेंगे, फैब्रिकेटेड है. अरे दैट्स नॉट द इश्यू. वी आर ट्राइंग टू रिकवर ए वर्ल्ड व्यू. वी आर ट्राइंग टू रिकवर नॉट फैक्ट्स बट ट्रूथ्स. दोनों में फर्क है. तो इसलिए मैं इन इश्यूज को दरकिनार करके दूसरी बहस में लाना चाह रहा था.
थैंक
यू सो मच.
फरहत साहब, एक जो भी है,
रजी साहब, मैं सवाल पूछ सकता हूँ? मैं आदित्य बोल रहा हूँ.
हाँ जी, यस सर, यस ऑफ कोर्स.
दिस आदित्य मुखर्जी.
जी, यस सर, आदित्य.
हाय आदित्य, हाउ आर यू?
Hi. Mridula and I are
nice.
Both heard the talk. It's absolutely fantastic.
That's an honor, a rare privilege. Aditya.
Mridula has a question. I have a comment.
Oh, great.
So पहले मैं अपना brief comment कर दूं. Farhat साहब
please.
And Professor Zaidi and Professor Malhotra, what a wonderful performance all three of you have made. It's a fantastic experience, to say. As a student myself of a period of transition, because I do modern and contemporary history, I can understand how important Farhat Saab's work is as a medieval and early modern historian. And what struck me in this presentation, I haven't read the book, is something that has bothered us for a long time, that the refusal for the dominant discourse, to accept the fact that there are alternate routes to modernity. That modernity doesn't necessarily come from one particular perspective. And I think what you described today, with all the tensions, with all the problems of the past, but also the roots of something new coming up, that was emerging in this period, which colonialism stops, which freezes, and it doesn't happen. So the organic development that was emerging in our own society, as you so brilliantly bring out, including on issues. After all, when you're talking of modernity, as you correctly said, the position of women is one of the critical aspects. That there was original thinking happening there, that even on sexuality, that the openness that existed at that time, I mean, the West would have to wait another century, to have that kind of openness. It was really eye-opening. Thank you so much. Now, Mridula has the question.
Thank you, Aditya. That
Hello.
was sweet. Yeah. Hi, Mridula. How are you?
Thank you, all of you, for a wonderful evening. And thank you so much. I really enjoyed the entire discussion, presentations by all three of you, and really look forward to reading the book. My question is actually connected a bit with what Aditya said. I wonder, you used the concept of modernity many times. I was wondering why you did not use the concept of colonial modernity. Is it for a reason or whatever? So that's a question. And the second thing is, the second part of my, it's not a question, but in a different way. How would you present your arguments, which are very complex, very sophisticated, and I think extremely path-breaking in many ways, to non-specialists who would be interested in the import of your work, into the larger debates and the larger issues presented before Indian society today, which the ones we are engaged with, What is the nature of our past? What is the nature of being Islamic society? What is the nature of the contention between different cultures? How would you situate your findings to an audience which is clearly cannot follow the intricacies of, either literary or historical debates with which we as academics are concerned with? How do you think your work reflects on the larger issues, and how would you present that to that audience? Sorry if this is a tall order, but it doesn't mean you have to do it just now, but it's just something that occurred to me, because I think it's so important, and all of us are constantly engaged with this. When we do this level of research, how do we then link it up,
Yeah,
with those
absolutely.
larger issues? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, these are important issues that you raise. About colonial modernity, I tend to believe that there were alternative formulations of modernity, and that centrality that we assign to colonialism in shaping modernity is a framework that we need to dispense with. And I think texts such as these, as Aditya just pointed out, take us to trends that lead to the more organic formations of modernity in the colonial world. So I think that this is deliberate, this is insistent, and that's why I don't refer to issues of colonial modernity. Conversely, I do think that projects of colonial modernity were in resistance, and these texts also refer to that element of indigenous resistance to the project of colonial modernity. But how to reframe this text? Obviously, you're very right. I mean, one of the important issues that these texts refer to is the shaping of the cultural heritage. And that's where I think these texts can refer to the present concerns. Both Ranj and Nadir, for example, when they discuss or when they refer to the shaping of the cultural heritage, one of the issues that they raise is the long antiquity of women's educational and creative achievements in Indian history. And not just Indian history, but the larger Persian network. And in order to make that point, they refer to figures like Sita and Parvati. And remember Sita and Parvati not in their familial roles, but as creative artists, as people who mastered the language of the time. But in the same vein, they also remember Khadija, the wife of Prophet Muhammad, his daughter Fatima. So that the cultural heritage that is being constructed is extremely inclusive. And one needs to see as to when both these trends, get polarized, get separated, and how in their separation, colonial modernity had a role to play. Do I make sense, Faradullah, or is it just as vague?
Yes, certainly. But I still think that it would be very good if you yourself could write a short essay or something, for
I'll
the
do that. I'll do
popular,
that. Makes sense.
which could actually bring out the implications of because this is so fantastic, the work that you've done. But you probably obviously cannot expect even people who are into feminist writing, all of them to engage with it. But how I think it's so important for us as historians to constantly take our researches and present them in more accessible ways where they can become interventions in the talk of the time, because we are at a deep crisis in our society. And I think when we do such fundamental work, it becomes incumbent on us to engage with that. That's all, so do that.
I totally agree with you.
Okay. So the next question is from Dr. Syed Amir from Maryland, USA. Amir bhai.
Thank you. Professor Hassan, Farhat Hassan enjoyed the talk. The discourse seemed to be shifting in the area of specialization. I am not a specialist, far from it. So I have got a simple, naive question and comment. Obviously, the talk is the non-recognition of women in the area of poetry. We know, at least from the early days, that one time in Awadh or Lucknow, the Shurafa used to send their children or their sons to learn tehzeeb, to their quotas, to their, I wouldn't use the word prostitute because it's sort of a bad name. And obviously, these ladies of the night, they were much more proficient in literature and all that to teach poetry. We do not, the problem is also for a while that there's such a prejudice against the women being poets. And a lot of time they wrote poetry, but under some pseudonym, not wanting to publicize their own name. And that may be one reason that we don't know that much about the female poets. And you mentioned also Jahara, Shah Jahan's daughter, and Zebun Nisa, Aurangzeb's daughter. Both were noted poets. I mean, we know that they left some kind of a divan, but they all tend to be going towards tasawwuf. And our poetry is focused mostly on mashuk and not towards God and tasawwuf, but ladies at that time at least thought that that was the safe way to have their poetry, or they may genuinely be interested. In Europe also, if you see that we don't see that many famous poets, female poets, as we see the men. Is it possible that in general, whether you're talking about the West or the East, the women, a lot more famous writers, thinkers, that their talent is more geared towards writing not poetry so much as books and literature. That is the main area, for some reason, seem to be where the talent resides, the ladies, as authors in India, also in Pakistan. There are famous authors, women authors. In Europe also, we see very, very successful female authors, not so much the famous poets. So this is a kind of naive question. Is that a possibility that what we are discussing, some of it can be attributed to that the basic or talent, it resides in one area and not so much in the other area?
It's not a naive question. That's an important question. You see, before I read these tazkiras, this is the kind of impression I had of women's literary achievements. And as a student of Mughal history at one of the best centers in medieval India, at Aligarh, when we read Jahan or Zebul Nisa and even Noor Jahan, for example, that's the impression we got, that their literary pursuits were restricted to matters that were religious and spiritual. This text disturbs that narrative too, because most of the compositions of Jahan, Noor Jahan, and Makhfi that you notice in this collection are deeply erotic, are deeply deeply erotic, deeply sensorial, and of course decidedly moving away from issues of spirituality to more hedonistic pursuits of pleasure. So I think there is an issue of how we remember these figures and how the projects of colonialism and the agenda of the nation state has served to sanitize forms of narrative, excluding and marginalizing certain voices and bringing to centrality certain others. And I think that's another important thing that one notices from these texts. Yeah, thank you.
But you don't think there is the intrinsic preference for the talents in one direction or the other? I mean, I don't know whether male are more greater talent for one aspect,
absolutely,
and women
no,
are the other
absolutely.
aspect.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely.
Oh, okay, absolutely. All right. I mean, there may not be a politically correct, but is for scholars like you, I thought I'm safe to raise that kind of possibility.
Absolutely.
Razi bhai, can I just ask a question, Razi bhai?
Razi sir has turned mute. So, Razi sir, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Asim.
Okay. Yes. Actually, I am bringing this discussion to your initial remark when you made that observation about this particular book being a part of a larger project of that relationship between literature and history. And here, actually, I am bringing some doubts of literature students. So, for example, when we read certain things, we literature students, and sometimes we are pulled in different directions. One very let me say one dominant method of reading poetry which we have been taught since our school days, or especially in our university classes, that poetry is something actually which draws attention to itself. I'm talking about that formulist paradigm where you are reading poetry for its aesthetic aspect and actually its worldly aspect, or rather its relation to the world, or rather its referential aspect is a bit backgrounded, and rather its aesthetic dimension actually comes on the foreground. So when we are actually reading poetry, and I'm talking about literature student, we are always pulled in these two different directions. It's worldly aspect, but at the same time, it's aesthetic dimension or its tendency to draw attention to its own language, to its own world, to its own universe. That means something that is very different from the outside world. So I'm just asking whether did you have any doubts about this particular aspect? Say when you want to say something very concrete, but at the same time, one is filled with doubts also, whether because something else can also be said which can be equally valid.
I mean, yeah, I mean this did come to my mind, and I think this has been an issue with you know with vernacular literature that historians engage with. And one of the arguments that has prevented the most historians from engaging with literary texts, and not just Urdu texts, but even texts in Sanskrit or Riti, for example, is this argument that these texts are aesthetic compositions, but constrained by the conventions of literary forms. They are largely imitative and have no reference to historical reality. And I was apprehensive that the same charge could be leveled against these compositions. But fortunately, it's good that you asked this question. I'll cite you one verse by a female poet called Wazir here. And this would clarify the things. She says, खबर देती है हिचकी मुझे दिल भर के आने की. Every hiccup reminds me of my villa. हमारे दिल के स्टेशन पे गम की रेल जारी है. On the station of my heart rests the train of my sorrows. What you see here is the appropriation of modern icons of modernity, the station and train, and their entanglement with Persianate metaphors of expression. So there's this argument that they are imbibed with conformism and are constrained by forms of literary expressions to the extent that they have no reference to historical reality, is something that I don't think is very right. Does that make sense, Hussain?
Okay, so let's move on. ठीक है, Asif? ठीक है? Okay. All right. Okay, we move on to Dr. Shadab Banu. Shadab? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's very fascinating, sir. I have read your book, but I have still to finish it. There are a few questions, and I thought that I would ask you later, and would not. But then I thought it better to ask before I forget my questions. Just 2 to 3 points. If I need a certain clarification with what you're speaking about the erasures. And I was thinking about whether you are referring to, when you're speaking of erasures, you're referring to this modernist reformist culture, or you're also speaking of the erasures in the 18th, from the 18th century or even earlier, whether these are rooted or embedded in the Persianate early modern cultures, or it's specific to the 19th century modernist, educationist, reformist culture that you're speaking about, especially because if we consider Muraqqa-e Delhi and the kind of memorialization that is done in the chapter where Dargah Quli Khan is speaking. This is a diary, this is a memoir, but he is speaking and appreciating the courtesans and the different performers and listing their attributes, very close to how the Tazkira writers are describing the physical charm and the skills and the creative talent of the performers. This is one part of it. the other thing is, how do you look at, when you're speaking about erasures, how do you look at the rekhti compositions by these men and the early 19th century? And when we actually see that by the mid 19th century and later 19th century, these rekhti is quite denigrated and is not seen with, we see erasure of rekhti by the late 19th century, but the early 19th century, we see Inshallah Khan, the Rani Ketki ki Kahani, and the kind of language that is used by Inshallah Khan. So when you look at erasures, how do you compare these, the Taskiras with Rani Ketki ki Kahani on one hand, and the other rekhti compositions? And also because you yourself have, in the appendix, yeah, it's really, Nishat has mentioned that, and it's very nice to actually go and look at the appendix where Nadir is listing the compendiums and where the women composers are mentioned. So whether it's the erasure is very specific to this mid-19th century, the reformist culture, or was it earlier? It was something that has been from the previous time. This is one question, sir. We'll take up the discussion later if you allow me to ask the other question, or you just answer this one and then we can see.
See, I mean, I don't know, but there are 2 or 3 things that need to be said here. One is that there is a fundamental difference between rekhti, which were composed by men, writing about women, and some scholars of Urdu, people like C.M. Naeem, for example, have made a very strong argument that even as they have a huge erotic input, they do not refer to the hardcore experiences of women's life. So there's a difference between rekhti and women's own compositions that these 2 texts engage in. But I agree with you. Both the rekhti and women's poetry are being pushed aside. There is an element of deliberate silencing that work in both cases, but for different reasons. In the case of rekhti, the silencing is a project of enforcing domestic, familial, household values, and push out discourses that were necessarily erotic or transgressional. In the case of these texts, the erasure is about erasing women's voices. So the pressure is there in both genre of sources, but the reasons are different. Secondly, I'm not saying that suddenly these texts discover the women's voices. These voices were definitely there in the literary culture, and it is from the literary culture, performative public sphere, that these voices were recovered by both Ranj and Nadir. So that's not the argument. That's not the argument. It's the argument is, and that is for this reason I'm very hesitant in arguing that these voices were marginalized voices, and that's why Foucault's formulation on discourse appear interesting to me, because these are discourses that are not marginalized. So these are discourses that work in a relationship of cooperation and contestation with the dominant episteme. So it would be a very naive and simplistic picture image, and I'm not trying to draw that there are these women's voices and there are these men who are trying to push those voices away. No, that's not what's happening. Huh? So it's a very complicated shaping of the literary culture in this period of time. And for this reason, the term that I use is these are erudite discourses. erudite discourses that are being pushed into disqualified discourses. And that's the central difference. Certain discourses are disqualified. They don't make it to the literary episteme. The discourse of a Diwana, for example, a lunatic, is a disqualified discourse. It would never become, or it would never be constituted as a form of knowledge. But these are not disqualified knowledges. These are erudite knowledges, but they work in a paradoxical relationship with the dominant episteme, and they are constantly under pressure from the dominant episteme. Is this clear, Shraddha?
Thank you. Thank you for explaining it in detail.
Thank you.
Okay, so there is one question I think that remains to be answered. Someone with the, I don't think it is a name, Levish anyway, 1985. Sir, can you suggest some novel or work on empowered women giving historic reference mentioned in English translation?
I've asked them to contact Nishat and see me for this.
Okay, good. Well, that was a. So anyone, if anyone wants to ask, please come forward.
Answer. They have to answer.
Oh,
Question.
any of you want to say anything, Simi Saba or Nishad, on this or on anything?
Yeah, I thought maybe we can suggest Umrao Jan, which is actually a novel written by a male author, but projects, to be presenting the female narrative of a woman courtesan in the voice of a woman. So that's a fascinating, I mean, technically, it's a fascinating structure that the novel has. And about Rekhta and Rekhti, tension, again, the novel is very complex because when Ruswa organizes this mushaira in the beginning of the novel, and he invites Umrao to recite her verses. Umrao comes and recites her verses, and both Ruswa and his friends, they make fun of Umrao, that so you recite in Rekhta. And Umrao immediately, she's offended. She says, did you expect me to recite in Rekhti? Right? So this tension is there. And this tension, I mean, points out to these, complexities that you just suggested. So I think Umrao is a text that should be read along with this book.
So, Professor Simi, are you also going to add anything? No.
No, I think that's fine. I think that's a very good recommendation. I think that's a good place to start.
I have a question. So the question is, I don't think that there's a bullet question. What any of you can just enlighten us, this suppressing women's voice, of course, everywhere in the world, in 18th, 17th, 19th centuries, what were the forces, how these men gradually or suddenly or whatever, anything happened to the men folks or the changes in the society that slowly they gave up and became a little more tolerant or inclusive, or started providing some space to women to express or to compete or to become a little empowered? I mean, where these historical steps are coming from? When? Is there any turning point? Are they taking any cue from Western societies or where? In Indian context, subcontinent.
Razi Saab, invite Farhat Saab for another lecture on this.
Okay.
Man, come on, you can adequately respond to this.
Now, I mean, is this a naive question? Like, why we seem to be now so much genteel, or I mean, we all become very gentleman type, my women are doing so well, my daughters are doing so well. I mean, in Aligarh, in JNU, everywhere, Jamia, you see a lot of women doing everything. I mean, so they were as capable then. Nidhi, you want to say anything? Nidhi, do you want to say anything on the women empowerment? Your whole life is just on that chart.
सर है ना अभी आपका जब लेक्चर चल रहा था तो एक आदमी से मेरा झगड़ा हो गया. He is a Jain and he is from RSS and he was talking about foolish things about the women. तो अभी मैंने आपका लेक्चर तो आई एम सॉरी कि 10-15 मिनट का स्किप हो गया, पर वो कह रहे हैं कि महिलाओं से 11 फीट दूर रहना चाहिए. तो फिर मैंने उनको कहा कि मुझे लगता है आपके पिताजी ने शायद
You
आपको
were
जन्म
doing better things. I said you were doing better things than
Yeah,
listening to
but
this boringly.
yeah, Nidhi works in the Adivasis and all those in Rajasthan, and she experiences all the, well entrenched, the shakas and all those, and people's mindset. So she's just tired and annoyed with people all the time. So away from RSS, do you want to ask anything about women thing and men?
Thank you, sir, for wonderful lecture, but I'm so sorry I skipped few parts.
Okay.
But
That's
so
fine.
I'm doing work with women, and of course, बहुत सारे challenges हैं, और मैं बहुत ज़्यादा struggle के साथ काम कर रही हूँ महिलाओं के लिए, without any financial help. But my staff members are so kind and very nice. Without any financial support, they are working for women's, and now we are crossing more than 8,000 women's के साथ हमने employment दिया है उनको, और पूरा women economy हमारे project की वजह से change हो गया market. तो पूरा market कैप्चर किया है, और मैं चूंकि आज पूरा लेक्चर सुन नहीं पाई, so I'm very sorry for that.
When the video comes, then you can listen to that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So thank you all. I guess आप लोगों ने कुछ हमको बताया नहीं कि आखिर कब जो है women थोड़ा उनका सब लोग बहुत रिजर्व हैं इस मामले में कुछ बोलने से.
मेरी सोच ये है कि ऐसा है नहीं, ये बहुत सिंपलिस्टिक पिक्चर है. या एक प्रिविलेज्ड क्लास है जहाँ पे women can have relatively better access to resources and rights, लेकिन ये इमेज जो है with the bulk of women coming from socially inferior class and caste background, वहाँ पे ऐसा नहीं है. तो इसको आप यूं मत समझिए कि बहुत सब्सटैंटिव गेन हुआ है, ऐसा नहीं है. लेकिन हाँ, ये जरूर है कि साउथ एशिया में ही नहीं बल्कि वर्ल्ड ओवर women's movements का बहुत अहम रोल रहा है. Women have actively organized large scale movements to defend their rights. और उनसे भी कुछ तस्वीर चेंज हुई है, लेकिन बहुत मामूली चेंज हुई है. I mean, obviously, for the bulk of the women, denial of rights is a daily occurrence. So is this experience of violence. तो हाँ, आप और हम शायद, हमें भी हो सकता है थोड़ा privileged background की वजह से maybe our daughters have better access to resources, but that's not the picture of women today.
No, sure.
बिल्कुल नहीं.
Yeah, but at least when you see in 50s a secluded section at Aligarh where burqa-clad few sitting in a lecture hall versus Naima Khatun becoming vice chancellor in whatever, that stage tells you that somehow.
इसको भी समझना पड़ेगा. I mean,
Still, you are saying that is not the true picture, of course.
मेरी समझ से कोई यार्डस्टिक नहीं है, obviously नहीं है.
सही. एक section better off हो गया है, but the rest. Ishrat bhai, were you attending the entire talk? Ishrat bhai, were you attending the entire talk? Unmute yourself.
No, I wasn't, unfortunately. I had things to do, but I did want to join it, and so at the very end, I have joined.
So how you will ask any question? You want to?
Well, first a comment and then.
Yeah, before that.
Comment on my comment.
Okay, let me introduce to one of the senior most Algerian here in North America, and retired as one of the senior foreign service officer from Government of India. He was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and other places. And he taught English in women's college when he was there at Aligarh. When, Ishad Bhai, in 50s? Do you want to say now anything to Farhat Sahab or to other professors? You want to ask anything?
Thank you for that introduction. I just have a brief comment to make.
Yeah.
Aspiration for empowerment, for rights, is a universal aspiration. It has always been there. It was suppressed in the past. But with the new circumstances where women have the right to vote, they can earn their own living, this aspiration for empowerment and rights cannot be suppressed. And it will happen gradually, but it will happen. So that was my really comment. And if any one of you likes to make a comment, I'd be happy to hear that. And finally, if anyone wants to ask me anything,
ये आपने दुआ दी है विमेन को क्या कि ऐसा होगा? ये आपने दुआ ऐसा हो तो नहीं रहा। फरहत साहब कह रहे हैं
होगा। मैंने ये नहीं कहा कि हो रहा है। देखिए, प्रॉब्लम जो है वो ये नहीं है कि let's also remember there are lots of men, and I suppose the men present here, at least I can count 3 of them. They are for women's empowerment, because I know it's no use denying them rights and the opportunity for self-realization. I think it's terrible, and it has done no good to men and to the society. I mean, lording over people is not real gain of any kind.
आपने 3 आदमियों का नाम किसका? फरहत साहब की बात कर रहे हैं क्या? ये जो
3 इस वक्त मौजूद हैं। I can see their picture. Others may be there, but I don't see them. But I suppose Ashok Batra must be one of them. The 4th one, at least 4 names I can see. Anyway,
name after read कर रहे हैं. Okay.
जी,
women के empowerment के कोई pro में नहीं है, कोई जरूरी नहीं है. सताए हुए भी एक आध लोग हैं, तो वो कोई
I am talking of I always say, when I say something, I say the majority, or let us say, not everyone will be of the same view, but majority, and also qualified, educated, thinking people. I mean, you can't just expect everybody to believe in something just because it is supposed to be good. Just because something is good doesn't mean that it will get universal support, because there are lots of people who know it is good, but they say, well, my vested interest is not in this. So it's complicated. I agree that it's not going to, but I have lived in societies in the Middle East, and I can see that 30, 40 years later, I can see that things have changed for women, and so they will change. Let us not think that their aspirations can be permanently kept suppressed.
जी शद भाई, बिल्कुल। बत्रा जी के घर में तो एकदम सर्टेनली चेंज है। वो पीछे खड़ी है ना, वो उन्होंने इनको कंटेन कर रखा है। अलका जी, ओके, थैंक यू ऑल फॉर
May I just say that we'd like it to be a little less gradual.
I entirely agree with you, but unfortunately, in human affairs, things happen only gradually. You know,
not necessarily. There are revolutions which happen. In fact, change often occurs through revolutions.
For example, though there was a revolution in France, and we know the government was changed, but governance took much longer to change. So I think it is even a revolution always does not. Even there was a revolution in America, but it didn't lead to a total change. Lots of things happened much later. So long as the women have this aspiration, so long as there are lots of sensible, thinking, educated men, things will change. It has, as I said, in the Gulf, where I spent 11 years, in Middle East, where I spent 23 years, things are changing.
Ishrat bhai, this argument is so long people have aspiration. Dalits had aspirations hundreds and hundreds of years back to become equal and free. So what happened? Aspiration alone doesn't do much.
No, look, takes time. Let's remember, it takes time. The person who had this aspiration was somebody called Mary Wollstonecraft. We have heard her name, and she lived more than 200 years ago, I think, or about 200 years.
अब आप लोग
उसने पहले ये आइडिया दिया पहली बार, and she articulated it. There were other women who were, not accepting inequality. I was reading about some lady in Egypt called Asia, and she was a brilliant intellectual, though she was persecuted and suppressed. This is something that will happen. I mean, even amongst men, when there have been new ideas about which challenge the status quo, the privileged position of some people, there has been resistance, there has been suppression.
Ji, chaliye, thank you very much for these comments, and I think they are all very tired and saturated. More than 2 hours passed, and now midnight to India, and here is the lunchtime. Thank you very much. We all enjoyed, and we will certainly be re-inviting some of you. And I think Professor Nishad is already committed. I think at the end of, I don't remember, I think in the end of this month, right? You remember your date? Nishad Sahab? Huh? आप unmute
जी end of this month I think.
चलिए आपको भी डेट याद नहीं, बस इतना मालूम है कि end of date मैं रिमाइंड करूंगा. Thank you very much. Thank you Farhat Sahab. Thank you Simi Sahab. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you all. Take care. Take care. Bye.